Sign it, or you'll be signing your own grave marker." Nayeli knelt in the saloon dirt, and neither one expected the stranger in the door to change everything. What happened in the next quarter hour is the reason the town of Rio Seco never lowered its head to that man again. And it started with a hand closing around a wrist that did not belong to him. The Cantina Dorada sat at the crooked heart of Rio Seco, a plank and adobe saloon where the afternoon light came in through gaps in the roof like something spilled rather than shone. Dust hung in it, thick with old tobacco and spilled mezcal, and the floorboards had gone the color of a bruise from years of boots and blood, and things men would rather not remember. It was the kind of room built to swallow sound, and on that particular afternoon it had swallowed a woman's cry and given nothing back. At the center of it, a big man had a young Apache woman by the wrist, bent forward across a card table so her knees scraped the boards. His name was Silas Vane, and he owned more of that valley than any 10 men had a right to, on paper anyway. Paper he had built himself out of forged names and burned church ledgers and a decade of nobody brave enough to ask questions. His face was flushed with liquor, and something uglier than liquor, a kind of hunger that had learned long ago it would never hear the word no. 10 years earlier, Rio Seco had been little more than a scatter of adobe walls around a spring that ran sweet enough to draw both settlers and the Chiheni band Nayeli's family belonged to, sharing that water without much trouble between them. Silas Vane had ridden in with a satchel of surveying tools and a smile that wore thin faster than most men noticed. And inside 3 years, he had turned that satchel into the deed to half the valley. He paid a circuit clerk in whiskey and coin to misfile grant papers. He paid 2 gunmen to make sure the families who complained understood exactly how little the law cared about their complaints. By the time anyone in Rio Seco worked up the nerve to ask where all the paper had gone, Vane owned the answer as thoroughly as he owned everything else in that valley. The valley's Apache families had watched their grazing land shrink a little every season, the way a hide shrinks in a slow fire, not fast enough to raise an alarm until there was nothing left worth saving. Nayeli had grown up on her grandmother's memory of a time when the wash ran free clear to the 2 peaks and nobody needed a stamped paper to prove where they belonged. That memory was the one thing Vane could never quite forge his way around, because memory does not burn the way a church ledger does. Inside the Cantina Dorada that afternoon, the men drinking against the bar were the same men who had watched it happen, 1 acre at a time, telling themselves each season that surely this would be the last one. Surely next year somebody braver would step forward. Nobody had. The saloon had become, without anyone quite choosing it, a kind of chapel to that particular cowardice, the smell of spilled mezcal and unvoiced shame hanging thick under its low beams. Nayeli had made her choice 5 months earlier, walking up to Vane's hacienda door and offering herself as a servant girl with a lowered gaze and a borrowed name, because she understood something the rest of the valley had not yet let itself believe. Vane's crimes were not hidden so much as simply never looked for. She scrubbed his floors and pressed his shirts and memorized the comings and goings of every clerk and writer who passed through his study. And at night, by a stub of candle, she copied what she could of his ledgers onto scraps sewn into the hem of her second dress. It was slow, dangerous, unglamorous work, the kind no ballad gets written about. And she had carried it anyway because someone in that valley finally had to. That was the room the stranger walked into a few minutes later. A room thick with a decade of swallowed fear, built plank by plank by a man who had never once had to answer for anything, right up until the moment a woman half his size decided she had swallowed enough of it herself. Her name was Nayeli. She wore a doe-skin dress worked with beadwork at the collar, patterns that had been stitched into that valley long before any surveyor's stake went into its ground, and her black hair had come loose from its braid on one side where Vane had grabbed her. Dirt streaked one cheek. Her eyes did not. They burned steady, the kind of steady that comes from a person who has decided somewhere deep down that she will not be the one who looks away first. "Sign it," Vane said again, dragging a crumpled deed across the table toward her pinned hand, a stub of a pen skittering after it. "Every acre from the Mission Wash to the Two Peaks. Your mark, right there, and this whole ugly afternoon is over." Nayeli spat at his boots, a small violent punctuation to the silence. "That land belonged to my grandmother's grandmother," she said, her voice level even with her arm twisted half out of its socket. "It belonged to my people before your kind ever learned to read a map, and your map is a lie built on a burned church and a bought clerk." Vane laughed, a sound like gravel dragged over stone. "I am the law in this valley, girl. I bought the marshal 2 winters back, and the circuit judge rides through maybe twice a year, and he is not coming to hear an Indian woman cry about ancestors." Around them, the room did what rooms like that had learned to do. Miners with rock dust still gray in the creases of their hands stared into glasses gone empty an hour ago. A pair of card players who had already made their peace with a losing life kept their eyes on the felt. An old rancher near the door gripped his glass so hard his knuckles went the color of bone and stayed quiet. A woman in a shawl at the corner table turned her face to the wall, choosing the dark of not looking over the shame of looking and doing nothing anyway. Fear had a weight in that room, and Vane had spent years building it, plank by plank, same as he'd built everything else he claimed to own. Nayeli searched their faces anyway, one by one, because some stubborn ember in her still expected different. "Help me," she said, and hated that her voice shook on the second word. Nobody moved. Not a boot scraped the floor. Her fear folded over into something harder, something with teeth. "Does not one of you remember whose land this was before his kind rode in?" she said, louder now, loud enough to bounce off the beams. "They are taking my people's water today. Tomorrow it is your children's." Vane's face twisted at being talked over in his own saloon, and he raised his free hand to strike her. Nayeli turned her cheek into the coming blow, jaw set, refusing to flinch away from it even as her whole body braced. For one endless second, the whole saloon seemed to hold that raised fist the way a held breath holds air, waiting to see whether this would be the day that changed anything, or simply one more afternoon added to the valley's long tally of afternoons. Nobody had stopped. The old rancher's knuckles went whiter still around his glass. The woman in the shawl pressed the fabric tighter against her face. Even the flies seemed to have gone still against the window glass, as though the whole room understood, on some animal level, that a line was about to be crossed that could not afterward be uncrossed. The blow never landed. A quarter mile out, Gideon had already noted the wrongness of Rio Seco the way a man notes a held breath. Shutters closed at midday. A dog slinking low along a fence line instead of barking at a stranger's horse the way dogs generally did. A boy of maybe 10 ducked back inside a doorway. The instant Gideon's shadow crossed the street, the particular ducking of a child who has been taught which houses to avoid and which hours are dangerous to be caught outdoors in. He had ridden through enough valleys strangled quiet by one man's reputation to recognize the pattern before he ever laid eyes on the man responsible for it. His horse, a rangy blue roan he had traded 3 hard years of travel for, picked its way down the main street, past a mercantile with its windows papered over and a church whose bell had gone silent long enough that swallows had built nests in the tower without complaint. Gideon had planned on nothing more than water for himself and grain for the roan, one night's rest before pushing on toward whatever country happened to lie next. Towns strangled this quiet rarely rewarded a man for lingering in them. It was the sound that changed his plans before he had even swung down from the saddle. A woman's voice raised sharp and furious from inside the low adobe building with the crooked Cantina Dorada sign hanging by a single nail. He hitched the roan without hurrying, because hurrying was a habit he had broken himself of years back, on the theory that a calm man sees more of a room in the first 5 seconds than a rushed one sees in the first 30. He had learned that particular lesson the hard way more than once. Boots stopped it. Not the fist directly, not yet, but the room itself, because a stranger had come through the bat-wing doors without any hurry at all, and something about the unhurried way he crossed that saloon floor made every man at the bar sit up a little straighter without knowing why. Spurs rang soft against the boards, an even, patient sound, like a clock that had all the time in the world to get where it was going.
Vane let go of Nayeli's wrist to turn, startled that anyone would dare interrupt him mid-tyranny. "Get out, stranger," he said, one hand drifting to the coiled leather at his belt. "This is none of your business, and in Rio Seco, curious men feed the buzzards." The stranger stayed quiet. He crossed to the bar as if the threat had been a stray dog barking at a wagon wheel, unbothered, and set his hat down on the scarred wood. His face, when the light finally caught it, was a face that had put a lot of country behind it, weathered around eyes that had seen things a man does not get to unsee. Vane recognized something in that look a half-second too late to matter. "Water," the stranger said, low, like it had traveled up from somewhere a long way underground. The bartender's hands shook pouring it. Vane took the silence as an insult, because in his world, silence from another man had always meant weakness before it ever meant strength. He crossed the floor and dropped a heavy hand on the stranger's shoulder. "I said, get out, drifter," he growled, breath thick with mezcal, "before I decide you're not worth the trouble of a burial." The stranger looked at the hand on his shoulder the way a man looks at a fly that has landed somewhere inconvenient. Then he lifted his eyes to Vane's, and there was nothing in them anymore that resembled patience. "Take your hand off me," he said. It was not a request. It had the flat, final shape of a sentence already handed down. Vane laughed for the benefit of the 2 men he kept posted by the door, the laugh of a man who has never once had to make good on his own threats. "Or what, field rat? Going to dirty my boots with your blood?" What happened next took less time to happen than it takes to tell. The stranger's hand closed on Vane's wrist and turned it, and Vane's grip on Nayeli broke as he staggered back with a shout that cracked in the middle. Before he hit the bar rail, he flung an arm toward the door, and his two hired men went for their guns. One of them got a shot off first. It grazed the bar's edge, sent a spray of splinters past the stranger's cheek, and cut it open, a thin red line that would scar white by winter. It was barely more than a nick. It was enough to remind the room that even a fast man bleeds. He answered with 2 shots of his own, quick and economical as a man closing a ledger. One of Vane's men folded against a table clutching his leg. The other lost the gun clean out of his hand and went down cursing. Powder smoke hung gray over the room like a curtain nobody wanted drawn. For the first time since Nayeli had been dragged in there, something drained clean out of Vane's face, and it was not liquor. It was the particular fear of a man who has just discovered, in front of an audience, that he is not the most dangerous thing in the room after all. The stranger let go of Vane's wrist the way a man drops something he no longer needs to hold, and turned to Nayeli. "You hurt?" he asked, and his voice had gone gentler. A door opened just wide enough to let someone in. She shook her head, though her chest still rose and fell hard, the aftershock of having stared death down and watched it blink first. "He wants the deeds to the mission wash and the communal land my people hold," she said. "He's spent years forging grants and burning records so no family left can prove a thing."
What she was about to say next was more dangerous to Silas Vane than any bullet in that saloon, because the papers she carried could sink not just him, but the men he'd paid off clear up to the territorial capital. Vane, groaning on the floorboards in a way that stripped every trace of the tyrant off him, reached for a boot knife. The stranger stepped down on his hand with a spurred heel, the silver catching the smoky light with something close to justice finally arriving late. "Stay down," he said, and the words carried the weight of a man who meant them exactly once. Nayeli crossed to the table where Vane had left his forged deed, and from beneath the collar of her dress she drew out a small leather pouch she had carried against her skin for longer than she wanted to remember. From it came a worn ledger and a yellowed survey map bearing an old land office seal. "I have spent 5 months in that man's house," she told the room, and her voice climbed to reach every corner of it, "working as a servant, invisible, so I could watch him do exactly what he does when he believes no one worth mentioning is watching. I saw him strike names from the grant rolls. I saw him pay a clerk in Rio Seco to burn the mission's baptismal records, so no family could prove where they came from, or that they had any right to stay." A murmur moved through the room, the particular sound of fear starting to crack under the plain weight of the truth. Nayeli held up a second paper, its ink faded, but its seal intact. "This is an order from the territorial governor demanding a full review of every land grant recorded in this valley. It reached the land office 8 months ago. Vane intercepted it before the surveyor ever saw it, and he has been burying it ever since, because it proves the mission wash and everything east of the 2 peaks was never his to sell." The stranger watched her with a respect that deepened with every sentence, the particular respect a man has for someone who turns out to be twice as dangerous as the situation that put her on her knees. She was not simply a woman who had needed rescuing.
She was a strategist who had walked into the lion's own den and come out with its teeth in her pocket. Vane tried to stammer some defense and managed only a mouthful of blood and spit. "You all knew," Nayeli said, turning to face the room, her words cutting like flaked obsidian. "You knew his fortune was built on my people's bones and your own children's hunger, and you drank quietly and let it happen." The old rancher by the door, the one who had gripped his glass until his knuckles paled, rose to his feet with a dignity that looked like it had been waiting years for permission. "She's right," he said, voice unsteady at first, and then gathering iron as it went. "My brother died over 11 acres Vane said were his by right. I stayed quiet because I was afraid of ending up the same way, and I have been ashamed of that every day since." One by one, other men stood, faces lit with an old shame finally finding its way out into the open air. Vane's authority came apart like a sandbank under a flood, all at once and then completely. "What do you want done with him?" the stranger asked Nayeli, recognizing without needing to be told that she was the true judge of this improvised trial the saloon had become. She looked down at the man who, 10 minutes earlier, had believed himself something close to a god in that valley. "Justice," she said, with a clarity that left no crack for doubt to slip through. "Not revenge. Revenge would make me no better than him. Take him to the territorial judge in Prescott, where the evidence cannot be quietly buried the way his letters were. I have everything needed to see him spend the balance of his days behind the walls at Yuma." The men of Rio Seco, armed now with a courage they had been denied for years, hauled Vane up roughly and stripped the false authority off him along with his coat. They loaded him onto the very wagon he had used for a decade to haul off the harvests of families too frightened to stop him. The sun was starting down by then, painting the desert the color of a bruise healing, orange sliding into purple, sliding into that particular blue that only comes at the end of a very long day. If a story like Nayeli's stayed with you past the credits, consider becoming a channel member. Tap join beside the channel name to keep these frontier stories coming. Nayeli stepped outside into the cooling air, the stranger a half-pace behind her. The whole town felt like it had let out a breath it had been holding for years. "What's your name?" she asked, honest curiosity plain in her voice, the first easy question either of them had voiced all day. He was quiet a moment, looking toward the horizon where the first stars were just beginning to show themselves. "Gideon," he said finally, a name that had not left his own mouth in longer than he liked to admit. "Why did you stop?" Nayeli pressed. "You could have ridden through and forgotten this whole valley by morning." "Never did care for big men leaning on small ones," he said, the plain logic of a man who had seen far too much of exactly that kind of leaning. "And I like how you stood up for what was yours. Showed more grit than every man in that room who found the bottom of his glass more interesting than you." Nayeli smiled then, for the first time in longer than she wanted to count, and it gave her tired face back some of its youth. "I'm Nayeli," she said, offering a hand that had finally stopped shaking. "My people owe you more than a glass of water, Gideon." "You owe me nothing," he said. A person's dignity was never for sale to begin with. "Maybe I'll stay a couple of days, though, just to see that paper reaches Prescott in one piece." They walked together down the main street, under a rising moon that had gone the color of old silver, the dust of the day still hanging faint in the air.
But everything about that air felt different now, charged with a possibility the town had not allowed itself in years. Gideon's own past rode behind him like something with teeth, patient and unhurried, the way old guilt tends to be. He had been a lieutenant with the cavalry once, the day they'd ordered him to burn a Chiricahua rancheria over on the Gila, and he had broken his own saber over his knee rather than carry that order out, and ridden away from the only life he had ever built for himself. Since then he had been a man without papers and without a home, honor mostly intact, everything else in ruins around it. But under that wide, darkening sky, for the first time in a good many years, something in him thought that maybe the search for whatever came after guilt might finally have a harbor worth reaching. Nayeli told him about her people as they walked, about the mountains that kept their oldest secrets folded into their canyons, about how a Franciscan brother at the old mission had taught her letters before the soldiers came and scattered that mission's congregation to the four directions. She told him about her dream, plain and enormous at once, of a day when her people would not have to fear that a forged signature could erase their right to simply exist on the land that had always known their names. Gideon listened with an attention that bordered on something closer to devotion. It was not only her strength that pulled at him, it was the unbreakable shape underneath it. They reached the small adobe house at the edge of Rio Seco, where Nayeli kept her people's true papers buried beneath the very floor she had been born on. Long into that night, by lamplight, they mapped out the case that would be laid before the territorial judge, the order of names and dates, and the exact shape of the lie Vane had built. Gideon understood, somewhere past midnight, that she was not merely a woman circumstance had cornered. She was someone who had understood, long before he ever walked through that saloon door, that knowledge was the sharpest weapon a person without an army could ever carry. They set out at first light, a small column of Rio Seco townsfolk riding escort with tools, and a stubborn new resolve where fear used to live. The road to Prescott ran long and unforgiving, canyon country where bandits liked to work the shadows, and the weather could turn from furnace to freezing inside a single afternoon. By the second day they were deep in red-walled country, the trail narrowing between stone that glowed like a coal at sundown, and it was there the sky turned the color of a bruise all at once, and the wind came up howling out of the north. The sandstorm hit at midday and swallowed the sun whole. Grit tore sideways through the canyon like something alive and angry, and for a long while nobody could see past the length of their own arm. Gideon pulled his poncho off and threw it over Nayeli, shielding her with his own body as the wind tried its best to peel the hide off both of them, and together they scrambled the horses into a hollow beneath an overhang of red rock where the worst of it couldn't reach. Huddled there while the storm roared past outside, the two of them close enough to share warmth in the sudden cold, Gideon finally told her the rest of it. The cavalry and the rancheria and the saber broken across his knee, expecting the particular flinch he had learned to expect from people once they heard it. Nayeli didn't offer him easy forgiveness, and she didn't call him a hero either. She only said, "I cannot change what you did before, but I can see plainly enough what you chose to do today." And somehow those few words carried more weight than any formal absolution ever could have. The rancheria he could not forget sat in his memory the way a brand sits on a hide, permanent regardless of how much time passed over it. He had been young then, 23, and proud of the bars on his collar, certain that following orders was the same thing as doing right. The morning his colonel handed down the command to burn the Chiricahua camp on the Gila, Gideon had ridden out with the rest of his troop before his conscience had fully caught up with what his hands were about to do. He remembered an old woman standing in the doorway of her wickiup, refusing to move. Not from defiance exactly, but from the plain exhaustion of a person who has already lost everything worth running for. He remembered a child's cradle board left behind in the smoke because there had been no time and no mercy left to carry it out. He had not fired that day. He had thrown down his saber instead, snapped the blade across his knee in front of the whole troop, and ridden away from the only career he had ever built for himself, choosing a fugitive's life over a soldier's clean conscience. For 6 years afterward, he had drifted from one territory to the next, taking work where nobody asked too many questions, sleeping poorly, drinking more than was good for him in towns where nobody knew his name long enough to use it against him. He had never voiced the whole of it to another living soul before that storm-bound night beside Nayeli, not because he carried no shame over it, though he did, but because nobody had ever asked in a way that made the telling feel like it might do some good, rather than simply reopening an old wound for its own sake. Something in the particular way she had looked at Vane on that saloon floor, refusing to make herself smaller than her own fear, had told him she was someone who could hear the worst of a man's history without flinching away from the rest of him. Nayeli, for her part, had spent those same 6 years learning her own version of the same lesson, that survival sometimes demands a person carry a grief nobody else in the room is equipped to understand and keep functioning anyway because the people depending on her did not have the luxury of her collapse. She recognized in Gideon's confession not weakness, but the particular scar tissue of a man who had chosen, at real cost to himself, to stop taking part in a cruelty he had the power to simply walk away from. It was not a small thing, choosing that, and she let him know it plainly, without softening it into something prettier than it truly was. By the time the storm passed and the canyon went quiet again, something between them had shifted into a shape neither one had a ready word for yet, though both recognized its outline well enough not to need one. They pushed on the next morning once the storm had blown itself out, the canyon walls scoured clean and glowing faintly pink in the early light, and by mid-afternoon the trail dropped them into a shallow valley where a homestead sat beside a slow green river, the first real water either of them had seen in 2 days. A rancher's widow named Constance Reyes ran cattle there with her 2 grown sons, and she took one look at the dust caked into Nayeli's braid and the fresh cut healing on Gideon's cheek, and waved them both toward her, well before either one had explained who they were or where they were headed. Over a supper of beans and flat corn cakes, word of Vane's arrest had already outrun them somehow, carried by a peddler who had passed through 2 days before, and Constance set down her spoon halfway through the meal, her whole face changing. "That man tried to buy my late husband's grazing rights out from under us for half what they were worth," she said, her jaw tight around the memory. We refused. He sent riders to burn our fence line that same week, and everyone in this valley knew exactly who to blame, and not one soul dared write it down. Her sons wanted to ride the rest of the way to Prescott as extra escort, worried about the stretch of canyon country still ahead where Vane's paid riders were rumored to be watching the road, and Gideon accepted the offer without much argument, having learned by then that pride was a poor substitute for a few extra rifles. That night, camped along the riverbank under a sky gone thick with more stars than either of them had ever bothered counting, Nayeli sat apart from the fire for a while, and Gideon came and sat beside her without needing an invitation. "You're thinking about the trial," he guessed, watching the river catch the last of the firelight in broken silver pieces. "I'm thinking about all the ones before me who never got this far," she confessed. "Women who tried to stand up the way I'm standing up now, and it cost them everything. And nobody remembers their names at all." Gideon didn't offer her any easy comfort, because he had learned enough about her by then to know she wouldn't have wanted it. He only said her name would be remembered, one way or another, because she had made sure of it herself, ledger page by ledger page, long before he ever rode into that saloon. They crossed the river at first light the next morning, the water running cold and waist-deep, Constance's son steadying the pack-horse while Gideon kept one hand near his rifle and one eye on the tree line the whole way across. And by the time the sun stood straight overhead, they had left the homestead and its slow green water behind them, climbing back into the dry red country that would carry them the rest of the way toward Prescott. They reached Prescott 3 days later, dust-caked and hollowed out with exhaustion, but with something still burning steady in both of them. The trial did not move quickly, and it did not move easy. Vane's allies tried buying off 2 of the witnesses before the first session had even opened, and a lawyer with soft hands and a hard smile tried to paint Nayeli as an unreliable narrator of her own 5 months of servitude. But she had dates. She had names. She had the ledger, and the intercepted governor's order, and a survey map with a seal no forger in that territory could fake convincingly enough to survive a real land officer's eye. The courtroom in Prescott looked nothing like the saloon that had almost swallowed her whole back in Rio Seco. It was a plain, high-windowed room smelling of pine sawdust and hot ink, packed past its benches with townsfolk who had ridden 2 days just to see whether the law would actually hold a rich man to it for once in that territory's history. Vane sat at the defendant's table in a borrowed coat that no longer fit the version of himself he had been a week earlier, flanked by a lawyer named Ashworth Pell, who wore his own confidence like a second, more expensive coat. Pell opened by trying to paint Nayeli's 5 months inside Vane's household as a scheme rather than a sacrifice. This woman, he informed the judge, gesturing toward her with the particular contempt reserved for people he assumed the room would agree were beneath serious consideration, inserted herself into my client's home under false pretenses and stole private papers from it. Whatever grievance she carries does not entitle her to burglary. The judge, a lean man named Corwin, with a reputation for boredom that concealed a far sharper mind than most lawyers gave him credit for, peered over his spectacles at Pell without much patience left in him. "Counselor, a woman does not require an invitation to expose a crime already committed against her own people. Sit down." and let the evidence speak before you speak for it. Nayeli laid the ledger open on the clerk's table herself, page by page, walking the court through Vane's own handwriting, where he had struck names from the grant rolls and forged a second set of signatures beneath the first. She read the intercepted governor's order aloud in full, her voice steady, even as Pell tried twice to cut across her, and both times Judge Corwin silenced him before he had gotten 3 words past her name. 2 of Vane's own former clerks took the stand that same afternoon, men who had once been too frightened to speak, and had spent the whole ride to Prescott deciding they would rather live with the law's judgment than with their own conscience a single day longer. One of them, a thin gray man named Otis Farr, confessed to burning the mission's baptismal register himself, on Vane's direct order, his hands shaking so badly on the witness stand that the clerk had to steady the inkwell so he could sign his own statement. Vane tried once to defend himself, half rising from his chair with the same bullying certainty that had once filled an entire saloon with silence, and discovered that certainty simply did not carry in a room full of strangers who owed him nothing at all. "This is a valley matter," he growled. "Not fit for a territorial courtroom, and certainly not fit to be decided on the word of a servant girl." Judge Corwin's gavel came down once, sharp as a rifle crack against the wood. "In this courtroom, Mr. Vane, a servant girl's word carries exactly as much weight as yours, provided hers happens to be true, and yours so far this morning has not been." The room went dead quiet at that, the particular quiet of people watching a man's whole world come apart in real time in front of them. By the second week of testimony, Pell had stopped objecting altogether, and Vane had stopped pretending to listen, staring instead at the courtroom window, as though the desert beyond it might still offer some way out he simply had not thought of yet. If you want more of these frontier rescues in your feed first, become a channel member. Tap join beside the channel name any time. The people of Rio Seco, the same ones who had once found the bottoms of their glasses more interesting than a woman on her knees, stood up one after another in that Prescott courtroom and testified plainly to what they had seen and what they had stayed silent about for years. The old rancher described his brother's death. A miner described a claim Vane had stolen out from under his family, with a signature that was never his own. Weeks later, the judge found Silas Vane guilty of forgery, land theft, and corruption, reaching further up the territorial ladder than anyone in Rio Seco had dared guess out loud. He lost every acre he had stolen, every deed he had forged, and the wash and the 2 peaks and everything between them went back to the families who could finally prove, on paper, the law itself now recognized, exactly who they had always been. Nayeli's name became something spoken with a kind of reverence across that whole stretch of territory. A byword for the plain idea that truth, given enough patience and enough courage from people who had run out of both, could still outlast a powerful man's lies. Gideon stayed at her side through all of it, no longer the drifting stranger looking for a way to outrun his own past at the bottom of a bottle, but a man who had, somewhere on that long road to Prescott, finally found a reason worth staying still for. In time, they built a simple adobe house together on the reclaimed land near the mission wash, its walls thick against both the summer heat and whatever winter threw at that country. A single cottonwood, already taking root by the door,
where Nayeli had planted it herself the week the deed was finally, legally, unmistakably hers again. Gideon stopped riding to get away from something and started riding out each morning to protect something instead: water rights and boundary markers, and the small daily peace of a valley that no longer flinched at the sound of an approaching wagon. Nayeli kept defending her people the way she always had, with memory and documents, and a will that no landowner, forger, or territorial lawyer had ever quite managed to break. Some evenings, when the day's work was done, they sat together outside that adobe house and watched the sun go down into the desert in long bands of orange and violet, the same colors that had painted the sky the evening Vane's wagon rolled out of Rio Seco for the last time. They rarely dwelled on fate or legend on those evenings. It was enough, most nights, simply to know that for the first time either of them could remember, neither one of them was alone in that particular silence anymore. If Nayeli and Gideon earned a place in your evening, that's what channel membership is for. Become a channel member and tap join beside the channel name.
Word in that territory still travels that true freedom was never about riding without a direction at all, but about finding one particular place worth staying for and worth fighting to keep. In Rio Seco, nobody ever called Gideon a stranger again, not after that day. And whenever people retold the story around a fire or a kitchen table in the years that followed, his name never stood alone in the telling, because it took Nayeli's courage, one weary man's redemption, and an entire frightened town finally finding its nerve to change the fate of that whole valley for good. The desert out past the two peaks never quite forgot what happened that afternoon in the Cantina Dorada, and neither did the people who finally understood that a powerful man's cruelty only looks unbeatable for as long as everyone around him keeps deciding to stay quiet. Vane's trial had left a paper trail long enough to reach the territorial capital itself, and in the months after the verdict, 2 more surveyors came through Rio Seco on the governor's own order, walking every boundary Vane had ever forged and setting it right, acre by careful acre, on maps that finally told the truth. Families who had gone 20 years believing they had lost everything found their names restored to roles they had assumed burned for good. An old woman near the mission wash, who remembered Nayeli's grandmother by name, wept the whole afternoon. The surveyor read her family's boundary back to her, unchanged from the map her own father had once carried. Nayeli walked those boundaries herself more than once that first year, sometimes with Gideon beside her, and sometimes alone, tracing lines that had nearly been erased with her own 2 feet, as if walking them enough times might stitch them permanently back into the land's memory. She taught 2 of the younger girls in the valley their letters that winter, the same patient way the old Franciscan brother had once taught her, because she had learned firsthand exactly how much a forged signature could steal from someone who could not read well enough to catch the lie in it. 2 years after the trial, the schoolhouse Nayeli had once only imagined became real. A single sun-baked room, built from adobe brick she and Gideon mixed themselves, with a slate board traded off a peddler's wagon, and windows angled to catch the morning light without the worst of the afternoon heat. She taught there 3 mornings a week, girls and boys both, Apache and settler children sharing the same bench without much fuss, once the grown-ups stopped making an issue of it. She kept a battered copy of the governor's order framed on the wall beside the door, not as decoration, but as a reminder to every child who walked beneath it that a piece of paper, read carefully enough by the right person, could undo even the most confident lie a powerful man ever told. Word of Rio Seco's case traveled further than anyone in that valley expected. A judge 2 territories over cited Nayeli's ledger when a similar dispute came before his own bench, and a newspaper in the territorial capital ran a short piece calling her testimony the clearest account of land fraud that court had heard in a decade, though the writer needed 3 tries to spell her name correctly. Nayeli never much cared for the attention itself, but she cared plenty about what it meant for families still fighting the same fight in valleys she had never once visited.
Gideon, meanwhile, had earned a quiet reputation of his own around Rio Seco, the kind that came from riding out whenever a new speculator showed up sniffing at unclaimed grazing land with the same hungry look Vane used to wear. He rarely raised his voice doing it. He rarely needed to. Word had a way of traveling ahead of him now, the story of the Saloon and the Sandstorm and the trial having grown a little in the retelling the way stories do, until men who had never once met him assumed correctly that it was easier to simply ride around Rio Seco's boundaries than to test them. Every year on the anniversary of the day Vane's wagon rolled out of Rio Seco for good, the whole valley gathered by the Cottonwood near the schoolhouse for a modest supper that had, without anyone officially deciding it, become something close to a local holiday. The old rancher, who had first found his courage in that saloon, brought his grandchildren every year until his knees finally gave out on the ride over, and even then he insisted on being driven, unwilling to miss the one day of the year. The valley remembered out loud exactly what silence had almost cost it. Gideon, for his part, never did put in for a formal pardon from the cavalry he had ridden away from, and never much wanted one. He carried his broken saber wrapped in a blanket at the bottom of a trunk, not as a wound anymore, but as a plain reminder of the one decision in his life he had never once regretted, even on the hardest nights. Some evenings Nayeli would ask him about the men he used to ride with, and he would tell her a little more each time, the story losing a little of its old weight with every retelling, the way a stone smooths slowly under years of the same river running over it. They were married the following spring by a circuit preacher passing through Prescott, a small gathering under the Cottonwood that had grown taller than either of them expected in so short a season, the whole town of Rio Seco turning out in a way it never would have dared a year before. The old rancher who had first found his courage in that saloon stood as a witness and cried without any shame about it at all. It was, more than one neighbor remembered afterward, the first wedding that Valley had seen in a long while that felt like a genuine beginning instead of merely an ending survived. The land office in Prescott kept Nayeli's ledger on file for years afterward, cited more than once when some other Valley's forged grant came to light, her name attached quietly to the precedent that a servant's patient watching and a woman's refusal to be silenced could unmake even the most powerful man's careful lies. Silas Vane served out his sentence behind the walls at Yuma, and was never once welcomed back through Rio Seco's gates again, and the valley, for its part, seemed to breathe easier with every passing season that he stayed gone.
Gideon built a small corral first, then a barn, then slowly, the kind of life a man builds when he has finally stopped expecting to be run out of wherever he lands. Nayeli kept her grandmother's beadwork patterns alive in the dresses she made for the girls she taught. Patterns older than any deed Vane had ever forged. Proof enough on their own that some things simply cannot be erased, no matter how much ink a dishonest man spills trying. And on quiet evenings, watching the same sunset that had once painted a wagon rolling away in disgrace, the two of them understood something neither had quite dared say out loud that first night on the road to Prescott. That courage, once it finds its moment, has a way of never quite running out again, not for the woman who found hers on her knees in the saloon, and not for the stranger who finally stopped riding long enough to notice she had.